San Juan River snakes through Pagosa Springs, Colorado, a ribbon of icy silver threading the rugged flesh of the Rockies. In the summer of 1997, Trevor McCall knew its every pulse, each churning rapid, each submerged rock that could splinter a raft or bruise a tourist's pride. He wasn't a man of towering ambition or polished pedigree. His existence was a tapestry of sweat and solitude, woven from the threads of honest labor and a quiet love for the wild. Rafting tours on the San Juan didn't shower him with wealth. The pay was a trickle, the tips a gamble. But they anchored him to the outdoors, to the wind that bore the sharp tang of pine, to the water that slapped his boots with a raw, elemental intimacy. It was a life of small victories, of guiding sunburnt strangers through nature's gauntlet and returning home to a cabin that creaked like an old friend. For Trevor, it was enough, or it had been, until the night the sky turned hunter and sank its claws into him. His cabin perched on the edge of town, a squat relic of weathered planks and rusted nails, its isolation a shield against the clamor of Pagosa Springs' modest bustle. On that late August evening, Trevor had just wrapped an afternoon run down the river with 4 college kids. Loud, brash souls with peeling noses and wallets generous enough to warrant a detour. He'd stopped at the diner on Main Street, a greasy spoon where the air hung thick with the scent of frying oil and burnt coffee. There, he ordered a burger, overcooked, dripping with fat, and ate it in the cab of his truck, the vinyl seat sticking to his thighs as dusk painted the horizon in bruised purples and fading golds. The mountains loomed beyond the windshield, their peaks jagged silhouettes against the dying light, and Trevor felt the familiar ache of a day well spent settle into his bones. By the time he kicked off his boots and collapsed onto his sagging mattress, exhaustion was a heavy blanket, promising the oblivion of sleep. But sleep didn't come. Instead, there was the hum. It crept in soft at first, a faint tremor threading through the stillness, so subtle he might have mistaken it for the distant buzz of a prop plane skimming the valley. He rolled over, pressing his face into the pillow's worn cotton, willing it to dissolve into the background of his fatigue. But it didn't dissolve. It swelled, insistent, a rhythmic pulse that seeped through the cabin's thin walls and lodged in his chest, vibrating there like an amplified heartbeat. He sat up, blinking into the dark, the sound now a living thing, a gnawing presence that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Barefoot, he stumbled to the porch, the wooden boards cool and splintered beneath his soles, their familiar texture a fleeting anchor. The air outside was wrong, sharp with the acrid bite of singed metal, thick with a static charge that prickled his skin and lifted the hairs on his arms. Above, the stars gleamed with unnatural clarity, as if someone had scoured the sky of its haze, leaving only pinpricks of light that burned too bright, too close, their edges honed to razor points. The hum was deafening now, a relentless force that rattled the cabin's frame, shaking dust from the rafters and drowning out the nocturne of cicadas and owls that usually serenaded the night. Trevor squinted into the tree-line, his breath catching in his throat as he saw it. A massive triangular object, its edges traced in faint blue light, hovering above the pines with a silence that belied its enormity. It wasn't a plane, not a helicopter. No roar of engines split the air. No chop of blades broke the stillness. Just the hum, a sound that burrowed into his marrow, and the slow, deliberate sweep of the craft as it scanned the ground below, its movements fluid and predatory. Military, he thought, grasping for a thread of reason to tether him to the world he knew. NORAD's shadow loomed not far off. Secret tests weren't unheard of in these remote reaches, whispers of black projects filtering through barroom tales. But the way it moved, smooth and unnatural, defied the clunky machinery of human hands. It glided with a purpose that felt alive, ancient, a shadow cast by something far older than the contraptions of men. Before he could retreat, a beam of light erupted from the triangle's belly, blinding and absolute. It struck the porch, pinning him in its glare, a radiance so intense it was like staring into the molten core of the sun, white-hot and merciless. Trevor stumbled back, his body locking rigid, muscles seized as if invisible hands had yanked every sinew taut. His vision blurred, edges dissolving into a searing white that swallowed shapes and sounds, And then nothing. Darkness engulfed him, a void that erased the world he'd known, leaving only the echo of that hum reverberating in the emptiness. When awareness clawed its way back, it came in jagged shards. The cold bite of a metallic surface beneath his bare skin, the sterile weight of the air pressing against his lungs, a throbbing ache in his skull like he'd been struck with a cast-iron skillet. He lay on a table, wrists and ankles bound by thick, unyielding cuffs that gleamed under a featureless white glow, their surface smooth and cold as polished steel. The room, if it could be called a room, had no walls, no corners, just an endless expanse of light that pulsed with a life of its own. A living brightness that seemed to watch him, to weigh him. Panic clawed at his throat, a feral thing rising from his gut as he strained against the restraints. But they held fast, indifferent to his thrashing, their grip as unyielding as the river's current in a storm. A voice sliced through the silence, calm and measured, echoing not in the air but inside his skull, a violation that made his skin crawl. Do not be afraid. Your compliance ensures minimal discomfort. It wasn't English, not precisely. Yet he understood it, the meaning unfurling in his mind like a forced translation, alien and invasive, as if the words had been planted there by unseen hands. Trevor's pulse hammered, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. As shapes emerged from the glow, 3 figures, tall and insectoid, their segmented, translucent skin shimmering under the light like wet glass. They moved on 6 spindly legs, each ending in clawed appendages that clicked faintly against the floor, surgical, precise, devoid of wasted motion. Their heads were elongated, ridged with pulsing veins that glowed faintly beneath their exoskeletons. A grotesque hybrid of praying mantis and scorpion, stripped of anything warm or human. Their eyes, or what might have been eyes, were dark hollows, voids that swallowed light and gave nothing back. One approached, its movements deliberate, holding a device that resembled a metallic egg, bristling with wires and syringes that twitched like living tendrils, eager and obscene. It tilted its head, studying him with an intensity that turned his stomach to ice, a predator sizing up prey. Human biology, it said, the voice cold and mechanical, a sound like gears grinding beneath a veneer of calm. Primitive yet sufficient. You will assist in our study. Study? Trevor rasped, his throat raw, his voice a cracked shard against the sterile hum that filled the space. What the hell are you studying me for? It didn't answer. The egg whirred to life, its wires wriggling with a grotesque vitality. A chorus of serpentine hisses that set his nerves alight with dread. He thrashed as one plunged into his forearm, a searing pain lancing up to his shoulder, sharp and electric, a violation that burned through flesh and bone. His vision swam, the hum of the device syncing with the hum in his chest, pulling something from him, blood perhaps, or something deeper, something vital that he couldn't name but felt slipping away, a theft of essence. Your species exhibits unique neural patterns. Another figure intoned, its tone almost curious, a scientist dissecting a specimen with dispassionate fascination. Useful for adaptive processes. We will learn and replicate. Replicate, Trevor gasped, biting back a scream as a second wire stabbed into his neck, the pain a white-hot thread stitching through his nerves, igniting every synapse with agony. What the hell does that mean? The mantis thing cocked its head, a gesture both mechanical and mocking, its ridges pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Replication ensures survival. We adapt to conquer. Conquer. The word sank into him like a stone, chilling his blood to ice, a weight that pressed against his ribs until he could scarcely breathe. Conquer what? Earth? Humanity? His mind reeled, thoughts spiraling too fast to grasp, a torrent of fear and fury crashing against the dam of his comprehension. Then he saw them, for other tables beyond his own, each holding an unconscious figure. 2 adults, a man and a woman, and 2 children, no older than 10. Their stillness was a silent scream, a tableau of stolen lives frozen in the glow, their chests rising and falling in shallow, mechanical rhythm. The man's face was slack, his beard matted with sweat. The woman's hair hung limp, framing a visage pale as death. The children lay side by side, fragile and small, their innocence a stark wound against the sterile horror. "Hey!" Trevor shouted, yanking against the cuffs until his wrists bled, the skin tearing against the metal, warm and slick beneath his fingers. "Let them go. You don't need them. Take me instead." The nearest mantis paused, its ridges pulsing faster, a ripple of light beneath its translucent skin that seemed almost to mimic surprise. It leaned close, its breath, if it could be called that, reeking of rotting fruit, a sickly sweet decay that made his gorge rise, a stench that clung to the back of his throat. "You misunderstand. This is not negotiation. This is preservation." It turned away, claws tapping a console that shimmered into existence from the wall. A panel of alien glyphs glowing with intent, their shapes twisting like living things. The light dimmed, and a holographic map flared to life. A globe of Earth, studded with red dots that pulsed and spread like a plague across continents and oceans. A crimson infection blooming over cities and wilds alike. Each dot grew brighter, then faded, a rhythm that twisted Trevor's gut into knots, a heartbeat of doom echoing in the silence. This wasn't exploration. This wasn't a study. It was a plan, a blueprint for something vast and unstoppable. A shadow cast across the world he'd once called home. Rage surged through him, raw and unfiltered, a desperation born of helplessness and the dawning horror of what he'd stumbled into. These things weren't just probing, they were preparing. For invasion, for domination, for something far worse than his mind could fully fathom. A purpose that stretched beyond the horizon of human understanding into the cold abyss of the cosmos. "Listen," he said, forcing his voice steady, a thin thread of defiance against the tide of fear that threatened to drown him. "You don't have to do this. Whatever you need, we can help. Just let us go. We'll figure something out." The mantis didn't turn. "Assistance is irrelevant. Your species' purpose is integration." The cuffs loosened slightly as a wire retracted, a fleeting mercy he seized without hesitation, his instincts honed by years on the river where split-second decisions meant survival. His right hand freed, he lunged for the metallic egg, slamming it against the table's edge with all the strength he could muster, a primal roar tearing from his throat. Sparks erupted, wires flailing like severed nerves, spitting arcs of blue light that danced across the floor. The mantis screeched, a piercing, skull-splitting sound that drove needles into his brain, a sonic assault that blurred his vision, and lunged with a clawed appendage swift and lethal, its edges gleaming with intent. Trevor rolled off the table, legs trembling but fueled by adrenaline, and drove a shard of the broken device into its torso, a desperate thrust born of fury. Its segmented skin cracked, oozing a thick, greenish fluid that stank of ammonia, a rancid cloud that burned his nostrils and coated his tongue with bitterness. The others advanced, claws clicking ominously against the floor, their movements synchronized and relentless, a chorus of menace that echoed through the chamber. Trevor hurled the egg's remnants at the nearest one's head, knocking it off balance, its spindly form staggering as the projectile struck true. He sprinted to the closest table, the man's, ripping out the wires with trembling hands, the stranger gasping awake, eyes wide with primal terror, a guttural sound escaping his lips as consciousness returned. "Run!" Trevor shouted, shoving him toward a doorway that shimmered into view, a faint outline in the pulsing white, a sliver of hope in the nightmare. "Find something to fight with." The kids were next. The girl whimpered as he freed her, tough despite her fear, her small hands trembling but resolute as she clutched her brother's arm. The boy roused the woman with desperate shakes, his voice a high, broken plea that cut through the hum. The mantises regrouped, their claws twitching with intent, their forms a wall of segmented horror, but Trevor didn't falter. Together, they fled into a maze of white corridors, the hum of the ship a constant, maddening pulse that seemed to chase them through the endless expanse, a heartbeat of the machine that held them captive. The corridors twisted and turned, a labyrinth of seamless walls that gleamed with an unnatural sheen, reflecting their distorted silhouettes as they ran, warped shadows that stretched and bent in the alien light. The air was thick, suffocating, saturated with the sterile tang of metal and something faintly organic, like the aftertaste of decay lingering on a butcher's blade. Trevor's lungs burned, each breath a ragged gasp that scraped his throat raw. But he pushed forward, the group stumbling behind him in a ragged line of desperation. The man, wild-eyed, unshaven, his flannel shirt torn at the sleeve, clutched a jagged piece of metal he'd torn from a console, his knuckles white with the effort, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. The woman, her face pale but set with a quiet resolve that belied the terror in her eyes, held the children close, herding them like a shepherd through the chaos, her hands steady despite the tremble in her fingers. The girl's eyes darted to every shadow, sharp and wary, a survivor's instinct in a child's frame, while her brother clung to her sleeve, his face streaked with silent tears, his small body shaking with each step. They burst into a larger chamber, and Trevor's stomach lurched at the sight, a visceral recoil that threatened to empty his guts onto the floor. Hundreds of pods lined the walls, each containing a human suspended in a viscous, glowing fluid that shimmered with a sickly green hue. Men, women, children. Their faces slack, their bodies unnaturally still, preserved in a state that was neither life nor death, their limbs floating in the liquid like specimens in a jar. Some pods stood empty, their glass covers cracked open, jagged edges glinting in the light, while others held figures he recognized. A waitress from the diner, her auburn hair floating like a halo, her lips parted in a silent scream. A kid who'd once lingered at the rafting docks, his freckled face now serene in its captivity, his eyes closed against the horror. The hum of machinery filled the space, a relentless drone that vibrated in their teeth, punctuated by the occasional screech of an alien alarm, a sound like metal tearing through flesh. "We can't leave them," the woman said, her voice trembling but firm, her eyes locked on the pods, a mother's anguish threading through her words. She took a step forward, as if drawn by some unspoken duty, her hands reaching out as if she could pull them free through will alone. "We'll die if we stay," Trevor snapped, his voice harsh with urgency, cutting through the haze of her grief. "We'll come back with help, now move." He grabbed the kids, pushing them toward a hatch that glimmered at the chamber's far end, its outline barely visible against the pulsing walls, a faint promise of salvation. The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on the pods, his shard of metal trembling in his grip as if he could fight the entire ship single-handedly, then followed, his steps heavy with reluctant surrender. The woman lingered a moment longer, her fingers brushing the air as if tracing the faces of the lost, then turned, her resolve hardening like steel. The hatch loomed closer, a beacon in the suffocating nightmare, its surface smooth and featureless save for a console that glowed with alien runes, their shapes twisting like worms in the light. Trevor slammed his fist against it, the surface flaring beneath his touch, symbols dancing in a frenzy he couldn't decipher. To his shock, the hatch slid open with a hiss, revealing a ramp that descended into the dark woods below, the cold night air rushing in like a lifeline, sharp with the scent of pine and earth. "Go!" he yelled, shoving the kids ahead. The girl stumbled but caught herself, pulling her brother with her, her small frame taut with determination. The woman and man followed, their footsteps echoing on the ramp, a staccato rhythm against the hum, and Trevor brought up the rear, casting a final glance back at the chamber. The mantises were closing in, their claws clicking with a rhythm that promised retribution, their forms a wall of segmented menace advancing through the glow. They bolted into the trees, the forest floor a tangle of roots and pine needles that bit into their bare feet, drawing blood that mingled with the dirt. Behind them, the ship's hum grew deafening, a monstrous roar that shook the ground, sending tremors through the earth that threatened to topple them. A beam of light swept across the woods, searching, its glare cutting through the shadows like a blade, illuminating the trees in stark relief. Trevor urged them onward, his legs screaming for mercy, muscles burning with the strain of flight, until they collapsed in a clearing miles from where they'd started, their breaths ragged plumes in the frigid air, their bodies spent husks against the cold earth. The ship didn't follow, or if it did, it retreated into the night, its presence a fading wound in the sky, leaving only silence in its wake. The clearing was a shallow bowl of grass and stone, ringed by pines that stood like sentinels, their branches swaying faintly in the wind. Trevor lay on his back, staring at the sky, the stars glaring down with an indifference that chilled him more than the night air. The hum lingered in his ears, a phantom echo that refused to fade, a reminder of the thing that had torn him from his life. The kids huddled together, their small forms pressed close for warmth, their breaths shallow but steady, a fragile resilience in the face of the abyss. The woman sat with her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the tree-line as if expecting the mantises to emerge from the shadows. The man knelt apart, the metal shard still clutched in his hand, his eyes darting to the sky, his face a mask of exhaustion and paranoia. "We need to move," Trevor said at last, his voice hoarse, scraping against the rawness of his throat. He pushed himself up, hands sinking into the dirt, grounding himself in the familiar bite of soil and stone. "They might come back." "Where?" the woman asked, her tone flat but not defeated, a quiet strength threading through her fatigue. "Who's going to believe us?" "Someone has to," Trevor replied, though doubt gnawed at him, a worm burrowing through his resolve. "Sheriff's office, maybe, or the feds. They can't ignore this, not with what we've seen." The man laughed, a brittle sound that broke against the night, sharp and hollow. "They'll call us crazy, lock us up or laugh us off. I've seen it before. People disappear out here and no one cares. Hikers, hunters, kids, they vanish, and it's always bears or got lost. Never the truth. Then we make them care," Trevor said, standing despite the ache in his legs, a fire kindling in his chest. "We've got proof. The marks, the bodies. They can't explain that away with some bullshit story." The girl looked up at him, her eyes sharp despite the shadows beneath them, a glint of something fierce in her gaze. "What if they don't want to know? What if they already do know, and they're just waiting?" Her words hung there, a question too heavy for the fragile hope they clung to, a splinter of doubt that pierced Trevor's certainty. He didn't answer, couldn't. The idea that someone, somewhere, might already understand what they'd faced, might be complicit in the silence, was a weight he wasn't ready to carry. Instead, he helped her to her feet, then her brother, his small hand trembling in Trevor's grip, and they started walking, the woman and man falling in behind. The trek back to civilization was a blur of exhaustion and fear, the forest a labyrinth that seemed to shift around them, branches snapping underfoot like brittle bones, the wind whispering secrets they couldn't decipher. By dawn, they reached a dirt road, flagged down a trucker who stared at their disheveled state with wary eyes. His rig a battered beast of chrome and rust, and made it to town, their bodies bruised and their minds fraying at the edges. The aftermath was a slow unraveling, a thread pulled from the fabric of their lives until the pattern dissolved into chaos. Trevor sat in the sheriff's office, a cramped room that smelled of stale coffee and old paper, recounting every detail. The hum that shook his bones, the light that stole him, the insectoid things that spoke in his head with voices like cold steel. The deputy, a grizzled man with a face like weathered leather, nodded and scribbled notes, his pen scratching across the page, but his eyes betrayed nothing. No belief, no skepticism, just a blank wall of indifference. Hours later, a team arrived. Men in suits, not uniforms, their questions sharp and clipped, their faces smooth and unreadable. They took samples from the site, photographed the scorch marks seared into the earth like brands, bagged the pod fragments that glinted in the morning light. The bodies were carted off in silence, their faces hidden beneath tarps, their forms reduced to anonymous shapes in a procession of black bags. Trevor watched it all, a hollow ache in his chest, knowing the truth was slipping through his fingers like river water, elusive and untamed. The official report came a week later, plastered across local papers and whispered in diners over plates of eggs and hash browns. A chemical leak from a nearby plant, they said, a hallucinogenic haze that drove people mad, conjuring visions of lights and monsters. The bodies? Victims of a bear, they claimed, or maybe a deranged drifter passing through. The pod fragments were industrial debris, the scorch marks a trick of the light, a mirage born of panic and fumes. Trevor read it and laughed, a sound that bordered on hysteria, because he knew better. He'd felt the hum in his bones, seen the map with its pulsing red dots, smelled the rot on the mantis's breath. This wasn't madness. It was real, and it wasn't over, not by a long shot. The others faded into their own silences, shadows retreating from the light of scrutiny. The man whose name, Trevor learned, was Cal, returned to a life he never spoke of, his wild eyes haunted by what he'd seen, his metal shard abandoned on the sheriff's desk like a relic of a war he couldn't win. The woman, Ellen, took the kids, siblings, it turned out, named Mia and Ethan, and vanished, perhaps to shield them from the questions that would follow, the stares that would brand them as broken. Trevor stayed in Pagosa Springs, but the cabin felt like a cage now, its walls too thin to keep out the memories, its silence a mockery of the peace he'd once found there. The river called to him still, its waters a siren song of familiarity, but he couldn't bring himself to return, not yet. The stars watched him every night, their brightness a taunt, a reminder of the vastness he'd glimpsed, a cosmos that cared nothing for the ants scurrying below. What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a place that defied reality itself, where the walls pulsed like living flesh and the air tasted of metal and decay? Would you fight, clawing at the unknown with bare hands, or would you freeze, pinned by the weight of something vast and unknowable, its shadow stretching across your soul? Trevor fought, and he survived, but survival came with a cost. A scar on his mind that wouldn't heal, a hum that lingered in his dreams like a ghost. The mantises are still out there, he knows, waiting, learning, preparing. Their red dots still pulse on that unseen map, a cancer spreading across the world he once thought he understood, a silent promise of the reckoning to come. Next time, he wonders, will luck be enough? Or will the sky open again, and this time, take everything? The days turned to weeks, then months, and Pagosa Springs buried the story under layers of normalcy. Tourists rafted the San Juan, their laughter echoing off the rocks. Diners served their burgers, the sizzle of grease a comforting constant, and the mountains stood sentinel, their peaks indifferent to the secrets they cradled. But Trevor saw the cracks, the fissures in the facade that no one else seemed to notice. A hiker went missing in September, his gear found scattered near the treeline, his boots half buried in ash-like soil that no one could explain. A rancher reported lights in the sky, flickering blue and silent, dismissed as a plane by the papers but etched into Trevor's memory like a brand. Whispers circulated in bars, tales of strange hums and shadows that didn't belong, passed between sips of cheap beer and nervous glances. He collected them like fragments of a shattered mirror, piecing together a reflection he didn't want to see, a mosaic of dread that grew sharper with every story. One night, alone in his cabin, he found a mark on his arm, a faint, silvery scar where the wire had pierced him, a crescent of altered flesh that shimmered faintly in the lamplight. It hadn't been there before, or he hadn't noticed, its presence a quiet intrusion that set his heart racing. It didn't hurt, but it itched, a persistent irritation that defied explanation, a reminder of the thing that had pulled something from him. He traced it with a trembling finger, the skin cool and smooth beneath his touch, and wondered what they'd taken. Blood, yes, but what else? Memories? Time? A piece of his soul he'd never get back, harvested for their inscrutable purpose? The hum returned then, faint but unmistakable, a whisper in the dark that made his breath catch, a sound that wasn't sound but sensation, vibrating in his chest like a tuning fork struck by unseen hands. He stepped outside, the porch creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the sky. There, a flicker of blue light above the peaks, a pulse that vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the stars to mock him with their silence. They weren't finished. They'd never be finished. Trevor knew it in his gut, a certainty as cold and unyielding as the river he'd once mastered, a truth that settled into his bones like frost. The mantises were out there, their claws clicking in the dark, their map growing brighter with every passing day, a web of intent tightening around a world too blind to see it. He'd escaped once, but escape wasn't victory. It was a delay, a pause in a war he hadn't signed up for, a respite before the inevitable. Next time, he thought, gripping the porch rail until his knuckles whitened. Next time they might not let him go. And the world might not be so lucky. If you survived this, could you ever trust the sky again? Could you look up at the stars and not feel them staring back? Their light a mask for the things that wait beyond. Their silence a lie hiding the hum of something vast and relentless? Trevor can't. He lives with the weight of it, the knowledge that the mantises are still out there, their red dots pulsing, their plan unfolding in shadows humanity can't yet fathom. He's just one man, one voice, shouting into a void that might already be listening, a raft guide adrift in a sea of stars that no longer feel like home.